Hello, everybody. You are joined tonight by two amazing guests. Two of my friends, Jeremy Koeries, who was with us last time when we had a discussion delving into the depths of what racism is about. And tonight we're also joined by George Emedi, which is a real honor to have George with us as well. Let me just tell you a little bit about George, and then I'll tell you a bit about Jeremy. Which I did share a bit of a bio last time, but I think this is a far fuller bio this time that I can share what these gentlemen are about. So Pablo George is a preacher, theologian, social justice advocate, originally from the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. George moved to South Africa in 2000, and he's married to Jennifer, an ordained minister, published author, and founder CEO of Destined for Greatness Publishing. And their union is blessed by 10-year-old girl, Grace Tawana Emedi. George has served as a church planter, seminary and biblical college lecturer, researcher, conference speaker, and social activist. His theology is defined by the intersection of theology and culture with a pronounced interest in the theology of social transformation, which is great to have George's voice tonight with us. His family is now currently residing in the US. Just got there in time, in the nick of time before lockdown in February. He's there for ministry, studies, and more. And George is passionate about the gospel and society. So George, thank you for joining us. It's really awesome to have you. And then Jeremy, who was with us last time. Jeremy is a follower of Jesus. He's married to Tanya since 1999, and they have 4 children. His passion is holistic disciple making for community transformation. And he leads J-Life South Africa, a nonprofit that trains, coaches, and disciples church leaders to mobilize disciple-making movements. He founded Exilic Music, a micro business. Can I change it to macro business, Jeremy? Prophetically. No. That provides business solutions for music creatives and training for future music entrepreneurs.
Very intentionally micro. Micro is a...
I see there's 2 micros in here. I need to speak into this. He has served in pastoral ministry, theological education, and is a part of a micro church leadership team. I like that term, not a house church, a micro church. And Jeremy holds a bachelor in theology. That's how we all know each other, is we all did our bachelor in theology together. Jeremy also has gone on to do an MA, and he's currently doing a PhD in practical theology. And he loves spy movies. Which is your favorite spy series, Jeremy?
I used to be Bond, but now it's the Bond series. But that's movies. In terms of TV, I love The Blacklist.
The Blacklist, okay. I've watched a little bit of that, but I've never really gotten into that. So I must try that again. Is that the one with our friend that's got a bad reputation nowadays? Isn't it? No, it's not. No, I was thinking it's Kevin Spacey. It's not. It's that other guy that sometimes makes me think of him.
James Spader.
That's it. Yeah. Okay, guys, I want us to dive in tonight. We kind of did some groundwork with Jeremy just on trying to speak about what racism is. And we want to sort of pick up from there and speak a little bit more broadly. And I'd love to, hear George's thoughts even about our previous conversation. He might actually want to just throw in some thoughts around that. But I want to begin with a bit of a provocative question, because I think the reason I wanted to do these conversations is the fact that at the moment we are getting a lot of narrative from the US about racism, about how we should see these things. And we, in our own South African context, I think have almost bigger issues to deal with. And I feel like we may be getting swamped by a particular narrative. And I want us to speak into that a little bit. So we'll jump in there. I'll be provocative, and hopefully we can claw our way back to a semblance of dignity. You guys can try and do that, because I'll be the devil's advocate. So I want to start by setting a little bit of a context. Clickbait, Jeremy.
Of all the people you could work for.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Someone's got to do it. So, so in the context of what's happening around the world, and particularly it's coming, a lot of the narrative that we're getting at the moment is coming out of America, but obviously a lot of people in South Africa are speaking about the same things. And but there's also been some pushback, and I want to just speak around that whole idea. So I'm going to play a clip by a NFL player who's now a sports commentator. There's also recently in the news, Terry Crews also came and spoke against Black Lives Matter, not as an idea, not the idea that Black Lives Matter, but against the organization. And there was a lot of pushback and confusion around that, because I think what Terry Crews was saying and what Marcellus is saying in this clip that I'm going to play in a second is that they understand the sentiment of what this organization, or of what the idea is of Black Lives Matter, and the sentiment behind that in terms of addressing some of the issues of racism that still exists in society, but that they have issue with the organization or with a particular ideology that comes with that. And the reason why I wanted to jump in here is because I think it's relevant to the South African context. And I'm posing a big question, and I'm going to throw it to you guys. That in South Africa, we have a lot of issues, but they often get hijacked by ideologies or political agendas. And I feel like that sometimes clouds the general discussion and our ability to really get after the core issues. So I'm gonna come with a question in a moment, but let's just quickly watch what I'm not going to play both clips. I'm just going to play the one of Marcellus, just for the sake of time, and I'm going to share it with you guys, so we can watch that together.
Well, Marcellus, I'm gonna start with you.
Yeah.
Is this a good idea?
It's not a good idea. I do want to give the players credit for their flex to even get this to be more than just an idea, but something that's going to be in reality. I give the players that. But there's a problem with when you start to go down this road of the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and how much social space is allowed for those who don't support in that same space. And that's where I wonder where this is going to go. In terms of identity politics, we know what identity politics does. It divides and it polarizes. No matter how you want to look at it, that's just the effect of it, no matter how great the intentions are. And we all know the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So it's an interesting play right here. I don't know how many people really look into the mission statement of Black Lives Matter, but I did. And when you look into it, there's a couple things that jump out to me. And I'm a black man who's been black, and my life has mattered since 1974. And this organization was founded in 2013. I'm proud of you. But I've been fighting this fight for me and for others a lot longer. Two things. My family structure is so vital, important to me. Not only the one I grew up in, but the one I'm trying to create right now. Being a father and a husband, that's my mission in life right now. How do I reconcile that, what I just told you, with this mission statement that says, quote, "We dismantle the patriarchal practice. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement." When I know statistics, when I know my reality, forget statistics. I knew this before I even went to Columbia and saw these same statistics that I'm going to read to you right now. That children from single-parent homes versus two-parent homes. The children from the single-parent homes, this is in 1995 I was reading this. 5 times more likely to commit suicide. 6 times more likely to be in poverty. 9 times more likely to drop out of high school. 10 times more likely to abuse chemical substances. 14 times more likely to commit rape. 20 times more likely to end up in prison. And 32 times more likely to run away from home. I knew that. You know why I knew it? Because a lot of my friends didn't have family structures that were nuclear like mine, and they found themselves outside of their dreams and goals and aspirations. So when I see that, or as a mission statement for Black Lives Matter, it makes me scratch my head.
Okay, I'm just going to play that much. I don't think we have time to watch the whole thing, but I think you get a gist of where he's coming from in terms of pushback. So I want to firstly ask you guys, and I'm going to give you both a chance to respond. Maybe we'll start with you, George. Do you agree with his analysis of what's happening in the States around this movement? And in a bigger question is, in South Africa, which lives really matter? Because it seems like in South Africa, at least, and bringing it to our context, that still a lot of black people in South Africa's life seems to have very little value, whether that's because of political agendas, whether that's because of other forces or power structures at play. But there is this reality, I think more so in South Africa, even than in a country like the US, where obviously there's been examples of policemen, killing black men particularly, and there's been other examples like that. So I'm going to throw that out to you guys, and I'm going to let you go first, George, and give us your analysis, give us your opinion on this and how you unpack this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. And again, thank you for this invitation to be part of this conversation. And I want just to begin by the title itself that you sent to us around the whole conversation of grappling. I think that concept of grappling with the issue of race, the concept of grappling with becomes important, because we're not going to get really, it's not finding the exact answers to the problem, but it is allowing the space for us to reflect and to struggle with the whole tension around this whole concept of racism and so on. So I understand the brother and many people would push back against the idea of Black Lives Matter. I understand sometimes where those reactions will come from. My concern, though, it is that we sometimes push back against an idea when we begin to look at it from where it is now at the point of climax. The Lives Matter movement at its point of climax with the George Floyd and so on and all the reaction, people feel uncomfortable with some of the expression of the movement, and we sometimes lose sight of the origin of the movement, the actual intent, because now we've got a framed idea. We can read the statement, this is what they stand for, but where did that all start from? I think when we go back to the idea itself, how did it start, we'll begin to understand that exactly what he said. It is a situation that started long before the actual structure of a movement as an organization. So Black Lives Matter becomes an expression of the feelings of the people that have been going on for years, for centuries, that may come to a certain point find some formalized structural presentation. And in that formalized structure, there will be some elements that people will feel we're not comfortable with this idea because of particular issues of dismantling patriarchy, about the LGBT community and so on. People will feel a little bit, this is kind of invading and also showing some ideological positions of some of its members. But I think the best thing to do is to go back. Where did the movement come from? The movement starts as an organic impulse of people who react to a certain situation that they've been going through. So he mentions the 2013, the killing of a teenage black man, unarmed, and that sparked an hashtag Black Lives Matter. So it's not an organization that is set down and structured. This is what we stand for. This is our objectives. This is our ideology. It is a tweet that sparks a movement. And as the movement is rolling, people begin to look at how do we structure this? How do we formalize? And in doing so, there will be areas that we can look at and say, this is unacceptable. This is not, does not really resonate with my Christian beliefs or my conservative positions or whatever other ideologies. That's where, for me, as we reflect around the question of Black Lives Matter, we need to reflect around the core, the ideal that is being raised more than a formalized organization with statements and so on, because we may tend to lose the heart of the problem as we begin to discuss the document, the founding document of an organization and not a movement that is echoing the challenges that people are going through. And I think that's where the link between whatever, and I'd like to refer to it simply as a movement, the idea of a movement of people who are crying out for help, who are pointing out some areas of inequalities and injustice. In that sense, we can link to the situation in South Africa or in any other community that is going through the same issue. We can see some correlation between, is there injustice? Because ultimately that's where the heart is. Is it a call to redress injustice? And if that is there, why would a leftist ideology resonate with the cries of the people, and others do not seem to take that to heart or to express it at least more vocally? So the failure of those who may have the right conservative biblical views creates a vacuum that somebody will have to fill, and that will resonate with the masses. And that's where, for me, the Black Lives Matter as a movement becomes an echo of the feelings of the many people who live under oppression. Some of the formulation will be flawed, will not resonate with my theological and conservative views, but I see them as a resonance of an echo of the pain and the injustices of the people. And that, in that sense, there is a lot in common with the injustices that people face in South Africa.
Oh, George, I love that. I love the way you frame that. It makes me think just of something I heard recently, in the sense that you can have a very detailed, articulated point of view, but at the end of the day, you need a clear message. People don't engage with detailed, articulate points of view. They resonate with something like, I have a dream, or Black Lives Matter. People can resonate with that because it's something they can hold on to and relate to. And I think what you're saying is really helpful. Jeremy, your view on this, and you jump in.
Just trying to get my mic on. Sure, George, that was great. Yeah, I think I've been a little bit been feeling a bit troubled lately. Haven't we all? It's 2020 after all. But I get a little bit uncomfortable, and this is me. I'm a heterosexual married man with a nuclear family. I believe in traditional family values. Okay, but I get nervous when I get uncomfortable when I see Black conservative voices, and I'm going to put my neck on the block here, being put up front to communicate their dissatisfaction with, for example, an ideology like Black Lives Matter, or social justice, or things that may seem like ideologically left, right? When I see that happening, and I'm not taking away anything from Black people. Black people can have whatever views they want. Black people are not monolithic. But when I see that happen, I can't help but feel that there's something else at work here. There's another agenda at work to try and deflect from ultimate issues of pain, the outcry from the margins, the outcry of Black pain, the outcry, and this is, wherever it might be in the world. I keep getting the sense that somebody's behind this trying to deflect, and it just makes me very uncomfortable. Now, I'm not saying that Black people don't have their own voice, and that Black conservatives can't raise their voices and say, I don't believe in this, because a lot of the things that the gentleman rattled off there in terms of family values are the same family values that I hold to. But I can get the fact that there is a concerted effort being made to dismantle some traditional values. But I'm still very uncomfortable with this. In the South African, it's this idea of silencing, that just troubles me. In the South African context, the same could be said for movements like the must fall movements, fees must fall, roads must fall. There's always kind of voices behind it trying to show you how dangerous this is. And I just feel like it's an attempt to silence the actual outcry. Because once we get stuck into that conversation, the ideological conversation, as necessary as it might be, and we're doing this tonight, which I think it is necessary, but my concern is that we could actually miss the outcry for justice coming from the margins, wherever those margins might be. And I think we tend to be unwilling to sit with nuance and to wrestle through, what of this aligns with God's truth, or how I understand God's truth from my perspective, and what of it does not, and can I embrace what does? Is it possible that wisdom could be crying out from not just the temple complex, the religious complex? Is it possible, like in the instructional section of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters, you find wisdom crying out, but it's crying out from like secular spaces. It's crying out from the marketplaces, from the intersections of culture and commerce. Wisdom is crying out, but it's God's wisdom. Is it possible that we can glean something of God's wisdom from outside of, your typical temple spaces, spiritual spaces, or can we only get wisdom and truth, and can we only formulate our theology using, a very narrow framework of, let's say, systematic theology, or even biblical theology only? Anything outside of that, I'm not even trying to hear that. I think that's a very narrow way of trying to formulate a theology or an ideology. That's I'll stop there for now.
No, thanks, Jeremy. You don't have to stop anyway. I mean, this is what you guys have both raised. Is a great place to begin this conversation, because I think, again, we are getting narratives, we're getting voices from the States, and I think that's normal for us in South Africa. We do get a lot of information from America, and whether that's a good or a bad thing, as we said last time, that's just a reality. But we want to try and bring this back to the South African context. But before we do that, I think both of you touched on a little bit of this. What would be your advice for the church in America, but coming from our context, coming from, George, you there now, so you a lot more tangibly involved in what you're seeing, and you've actually described a little bit of that for me before we started recording. But what would be your advice in terms of this kind of a situation, especially for the, like you're saying, for the conservative Christians in America who maybe are feeling threatened by some of the things they are seeing, some of the things that are happening? And look, let's admit there are some extremes. There's always extremes that happen sometimes in movements. So maybe they're focusing on the extremes. Maybe they hear voices like Marcellus or like Terry Crews, and they associate with those voices because of those conservative values, and they feel a comfort in that place because we don't want the family values to be destroyed. We don't want we don't believe in Marxism or whatever the thing is that is their fear area. How can they now really take hold of this in a healthier way to actually be agents of change? Because surely the kingdom of God should be at the forefront of seeing real change in society. And at the moment, it seems like because of this widening of the gap between whether you want to call it the left and the right, I mean, that's not really it, but this widening of the gap, I'm feeling like the church is falling in that gap. So what would be your advice or your comment on that? George, you want to go first?
Before I get to that question, I want to just point something that when Jeremy was speaking that just caught my attention, because it's something that I'm passionate about, the concept of the margins. And that margin is complex. That margin is plural. That those who are crying are not only the poor conservative Christians, those who feel oppressed, whether rightly or wrongly, whether their feeling of oppression is unbiblical, they're still part of that margin. And that's where, and you know my position, probably just for our view as well to understand, as Jeremy said from the beginning, I'm a conservative, I'm a conservative Christian, an evangelical, but there is also a cry from those, for example, who might be non-heterosexual. And they would be crying for and raising issues that we should not attempt as a church to simply silence them, because if they don't cry, we assume the problem is not there. They are part of that margin, and the question becomes, how do we handle that? How do we respond to the cries of the lesbian and the homosexual community? How do we respond to the cries of the non-conformist structures of families? How do we respond to a society that is growing more and more into a single-parent society where the traditional structure of marriage is not the case, where there is a more pronounced phenomenon of single parenting? How do we react to that? There's one thing to simply wish that's not the way it should be. It's another thing to see that as an indictment to how do we respond to that as a church? And I think that's where also, moving on to your question, becomes the issue of the church, whether in America or in South Africa. What is happening is an indictment to us as church, to ask ourselves, where are we at what we're doing? We want it easy. And this is my personal view. We want it easy. We want a society that will simply accept our narrative, believe it, and walk with it. We're failing to understand that the social values cannot be legislated by the states. So we want a conservative government that will protect the family, that will protect a certain way of life that we knew it. Behavioral change, ethics needs to be a product of the transformation of the heart. If society is drifting away into a leftist ideology, a leftist appeal, I think the question should be asked to the church, what are we doing in transforming the church, the society? Are we still salt and light? Because if we were to do what we were called to do, I think, and it depends as well on some eschatological view of people, I think the transformation of society is a result of the church working and doing what it was called to do. For me, the church needs to get back to being church, to doing what the church is called to do. And that would mean we need to review our theology. We've got to re-engage our theology. Is our theology more concerned with the so-called salvation of the soul than we do not take into account the broad dynamic of social reality? Are we really speaking into society, into social issues? And I think that's where the struggle becomes, because everyone want to move in that direction of the social engagement. And here I think you guys discussed this in the past, in the previous video. There is a sense of a pushback to everything that is got to do with, can we engage what people are going through on a daily basis? Can we engage with poverty? Can we engage with race? Can we engage with whatever other phenomenon is happening? So the church is failing to self-correct. The church is failing to evaluate its theology and its application of their theology. But we want society to remain the way it was and to simply say amen to whatever we say. And it's not working. And it's not an issue here for me that because it works, it's good. The issue is, are we a relevant church? Are we truly salt and light in the community? Are we really answering to the questions that people are asking? It's been my view for a while that especially the church in Africa, we many times answer questions that do not have any relevance to our people. Because the theology that we were all trained in has been an attempt to answer certain questions that were contextual to particular people. The real question at the moment becomes, what are the boiling issues that we face as society in Africa, in South Africa? And how are we responding theologically to those issues? I'll put to you, for example, we've been through the same theological institution. We spent 4 years together. In the 4 years, issues of race happened. They were real in society. They were real in society. Still, issues of land in the recent past are a major issue in South Africa. What subject dealt with the theology of land while we were at seminary? What subject engaged those issues of race while we were at seminary? It was a no-go. You don't talk about those things. As if God is silent on the issue of race, is silent on the issue of poverty. We were facing every day in our classroom, the left side, I think, or right side of our building, we can see Langa and the extreme poverty facing us in the eye. But no theology is coming from the classroom to address that. Somebody else is going to address the issue. Somebody else will raise the issue, and it will be called anti-biblical. I think the church has failed to review itself, review theology, re-engage its own theology mission, and we want everybody else to not go in that direction because we failed to be there. It's an indictment to the church, and yeah, that's so far where I am.
George. No, I'm loving what you're saying. Jeremy, do you want to jump in on the back of what George said? I can't even remember what my question was, but maybe you pick it up. I think just kind of advice.
If we have for the American church.
Yes, we're trying to fix the American church's problems.
Let's fix them. Yeah, no, I don't have a word for the American church. But maybe just a comment. Building on what George was saying again, with regards to the margins, I mean, that resonates with me so much. The margins are so complex. When you think of the margins or you think of the oppressed, it's such a complex phenomenon in this day and age. And everybody's vying for, kind of an equal voice from the margins, because there's been so much marginalization and oppression for so many years. And you look at all the issues and all the trends and all the hashtags, Me Too. It's all really voices coming from those kind of marginal spaces. And the challenge that I find is that I think the church and let's not limit it, or I would not limit it to the American church, but I guess the church that has been influenced by Western Christianity. We have, I think we've truncated the gospel. Our understanding of the gospel has been limited to the vertical, individualistic, personal vantage point. So my personal relationship with Jesus, at the expense of a more holistic. I'm called to love God. I'm called to love people. I'm called also to, in terms of being made in God's image, there's also this who am I question. I need to love myself. I need to love my neighbor as I love myself. So who am I? And we don't do a lot of hard theological work in terms of identity. And often, I mean, I heard the phrase being used earlier on, identity politics. Often I find that word also being used usually in quite a dismissive sense, that whenever we start talking about and wrestling theologically around issues of racial justice or justice for the oppressed, then we start talking about identity politics, and it's often used as a way of kind of snuffing out the conversation. So there's that love of self, and also, of course, our command to care for the earth, to care for creation. That is not some sort of progressive or leftist ideology. That's the story of the Bible.
Yes.
Genesis 1.
And say that again.
No, I said that's Genesis 1. That's our command.
Genesis 1, first page, second page. But so we've truncated the gospel, and even the finished work of Jesus on the cross, we've limited that to just kind of substitutionary atonement. It's just me and mine. And yet there are more cosmic, holistic, not just implications, but just the way the message of the cross is portrayed throughout Scripture is a lot more holistic than just individualistic. So I think that's a problem that needs to be addressed, and that's a theological problem. But in addition to that, I think our faith has become very, let's call it creedal. So when we think about our faith, it's about right belief. It's about holding to certain values and then doing our best to hem or hedge those values, to protect those values, because those are the core tenets of our faith, and we need to protect and preserve and contend for that, you know, all of which speaks to a very sort of a creedal view of the faith, so that when other forces, you know, secular forces or forces from other ideologies, other systems and other worldviews, they begin to challenge that, then our retreat is almost kind of like a bunker mentality. I need to protect this. I need to shield and safeguard this because this is the faith. That's a very creedal view of faith. And I think we actually call to something more. I'm not saying we mustn't be creedal. I'm not saying we mustn't know what we believe and we mustn't be able to articulate what we believe. But surely faith without works is dead. Surely there's a missional dimension to our faith. Surely there's a lived faith that we are called to in this Jesus movement. When Jesus calls us to be his disciples, he actually calls us to live it out and to be willing to live for it so much that you'll die for it. That's beyond creedal. That's a lived faith. And I think the challenge is with the Western church, we don't really know how to live our faith. So back to the margins, I think it's Alan Hirsch uses the language of Shema spirituality, which is really just the Shema, Deuteronomy 6. Love God with heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. So, and you would say that was the core, that was creedal, but it framed and shaped the worldview of how Israelites not just were taught to think, but were taught to live. So how do you love your neighbor as yourself when your neighbor is in the margins and your neighbor doesn't believe like you, doesn't think like you, doesn't act like you, doesn't share the same sexual orientation as you, doesn't look like you, doesn't earn like you, doesn't believe like you? It's still your neighbor. How do you do your theology? How do you practice your faith in that space? So this moves beyond the creedal understanding of faith, and I don't think we figured that out. We don't know how to love people. We don't know how to be neighborly to people who don't believe like us, who don't live like us, and who don't act like us.
Sure. Yeah, that's very powerful. Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts that I wanted to just throw out there in terms of that, but I want to, just bringing it back to South Africa and our context. And I think the reason why I wanted to frame the question in the way that I did, which is quite provocative, is because exactly what you guys are both articulating in different ways, but similar message, is around where, as the church, we've fallen short. Where as the church do we need to engage in a broader understanding of what the gospel is? And I always like to use the term of the gospel of the kingdom, because I think that's one of the ways in which we've diminished the gospel, is we've made it a gospel of salvation or a gospel of whatever. And I think a part of that comes from us reading Paul in isolation. I think a lot of people build their theology out of Paul without reading it in the context of the Old Testament or the context of the Gospels, because that's how Paul taught the gospel. He didn't teach his letters. His letters are a byproduct of what he taught. So I think that's part of the thing, is we've built a theology that's sort of this very Pauline theology, and we've in some ways excluded his context. But we, at the same time, in South Africa, and I realize that this is maybe the tension that people are feeling as well, because they realize there is this tightrope of what is it that we are called to do as the church, and how do we then stay on this tightrope where there are these ideologies on both sides, very strong political ideologies that people get pulled into on the right-hand side or on the left, or feel that these things are impeding, and how does the church really stay focused? And I think the big struggle in South Africa is that, where in America, I think the narrative makes a lot of sense, purely in terms of what people are experiencing, is that Black people in America, or minorities in America, are the minority. They are still very much in the minority in many different ways. In South Africa, Black people are the majority, and yet we still have the same, like the margins that you're talking about. Our margins are very wide. We don't have narrow margins. We actually have massive margins. How does all of these factors are playing into how people are understanding this and saying, well, what is really the problem? How do we actually deal with this stuff in South Africa in terms of race? But I think a bigger issue is power and poverty. Those are the real core issues that I think is happening in South Africa. So I don't know if you guys are getting what I'm trying to say, and I'm just throwing those ideas out at you and hearing your response. Maybe Jeremy, you want to go first this time?
Yeah,
You
go first.
Martin just sprinkles things all over the floor, and then we just need to.
You just have to pick it up, run with it.
Keyword. Oh man, sure. Yeah. I mean, you said it. Power. You raised that. Again, you want to talk about our theology around power is also very, I think, very narrow. I mean, the language of the original language of the New Testament Greek, the power is a colorless term. The principalities and the powers, they are colorless. They are not intentionally demonic powers, demonic spiritual powers or evil human powers. It's just a neutral term. And so the context gives it color. And I think that's intentional, because I believe God inspired the writers to use those words, because it's all of the above. And we've tended to see power as, I don't know, like we see it as human, but on a very individualistic level. So that's like evil, that's ungodly, that's, Jesus says don't desire to have the kind of power that the Gentiles, the worldly rulers have, who lord it over others. So we see that as more individual in the life of a leader, or we see the powers as purely spiritual, demonic. And I think we miss the reality of powers being systemic and structural. And if you want to talk about South Africa, that's us. I mean, how can you have such a wide margin, as you put it, only if there's a real evil power and powers dominating those systems? And as soon as you start talking about,
can I jump in there, Jeremy? And I'm playing the devil's advocate role here. So what people will say then is, but so much of the power today in South Africa is in the hands of Black people using it against their own people. That will be people's comeback to that and saying, well, surely then it's not a racial issue, it's something else, because this is the reality of South Africa today. I mean, I was just watching that BBC documentary looking at some of our hospitals that people are now having to go to in the middle of COVID, and people are saying, well, where's the 3 trillion rand that's been squandered by the government, which is predominantly a Black government, and they are the ones who have power.
Sure. And again, my response would be, if this is a Christian conversation, if this is a Christian rebuttal, then that's ideological. That person believes, and I have a problem with this, I think it's a theologically flawed view. That person believes that it's the role of political power to solve social issues. That's what they believe. It's fundamentally the role of political powers to solve social issues. And I'm going, okay, so your faith is dichotomized. Your faith is all spiritual, and you're leaving all of the social stuff to another realm, to the government, which again speaks to this truncated view of the gospel. You spoke about the gospel of the kingdom as better language. If we really live the gospel of the kingdom, then we would not be saying that. We would be thinking, okay, how do I use my power and what are the social implications of this power that I have? And so for me, that's fundamentally the wrong question if it's coming from a Christian worldview. And I've heard that a lot. A lot of Christians have said this to me. Yeah, but the existing powers, the powers that be, are using their power against their own people. Yeah, okay, then we still not ready to do what we believe the government should do. And I think that's a problem. I think a church that does not see the social implications of the gospel and the social implications of their faith is a church that is ineffective and, dare I say, almost irrelevant in the world.
Absolutely.
So let's be specific. When we talk about power, let's talk about power. I mean, yeah, there's political power, and there may be a few who are holding political power and who are using that as sway against the masses, and the masses are in the margins. But there's economic power, and I don't think it's fair to say that a handful now hold all of the economic power. A handful of, let's be specific, a handful of black leaders hold all the economic sway in the country. That's inaccurate. That is not the truth. So if we want to talk about power, then we have to talk across the board. Let's talk about social power. Let's talk about the power of access, the power of opportunity. Let's talk about economic power. We need to talk about all those powers. That power does not sit in the hands of the majority of the people. It does sit in the hands of some church leaders. And so again, is your faith only creedal, or do you actually live your faith?
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, George, what are your...
Sorry, I don't have a nice...
No, it's good.
I think I agree with a lot of what Jeremy has said, because if we want to look at the context of South Africa, majority that is living in poverty versus a minority that is a little bit well off, or even looking at that against the idea that but the blacks are in power, that whole analysis needs to be placed within its right context. And the context includes historical context. The context will have to include historical context. It cannot only simply be a context of the 25 years where the power shifted hands. It will have to include, because these people, the people we have now, these 55 people are part of a long story that goes way back. And I know people would sometimes say, but why should we have to go back to apartheid? Because we cannot not go there. It's impossible. The reality of what people are living today has a direct link to the past, a direct link to the recent past, and the 100 years, 200 years, 400 years past. It's this. We are a product. South African people today is a product of its history, and if we look at it that way, we will understand where, even on a political level, how do we understand then the power concept? How do we understand the people, the majority, the 80% of the people who holds voting power in their hands still fail to do the right thing? We will understand where is the financial, economic power that sometimes manipulates situations in the country. So the historical context will help us understand the economic dynamics, the political dynamics, the social dynamics in which we live. And that's where, if there is corruption today, yes, that corruption needs to be dealt with, but should not be dealt with or simply by disregarding the past. We've got to understand the reality of South Africa is complex, but it's still got to do with the past. If America is crying today, and this is, we're doing that comparison time to time, if America, the black people are crying today, well, after how many years since the Emancipation Declaration? But the reality has not completely changed. The reality of the majority black living still in poverty has not changed. And yes, we can say, but they have the opportunity, but they are the product of a system. They're the product of a system that perpetuates that poverty. That is the product of a system that creates more Black people being incarcerated, mass incarceration, that destroys the fiber of that Black society. So the historical dimension cannot be disregarded. We've got to look at it with that in mind. Look at where South Africa came from. We only have 25 years or so after democracy, and a lot of the feel of that past is still with us. The influence of political and economic power of the past is still with the people today. The power or the lack thereof of the church is still there from the past to today. Probably even we lost much of it, because I would contend that the church did a better job of engaging social and political issues than it's doing now. And I think there is an issue that we've got to look back, if we will do a better assessment of what is happening right now. Yes, corruption in South Africa and the widening of the gap of the have and the have-nots and the poverty that we still see. The government has got a huge responsibility to it. The people, the voters, the people have got a huge responsibility to the status quo. But we cannot deny the fact that there is still an influence from where this mass of people came from, of how they've been affected psychologically, how they've been affected spiritually, how they've been affected in the fiber of that same society. We've got a broken community that has not yet been fixed, but that is expected to be productive. And one of the cries sometimes, yes, I've only been in South Africa 20 years, arrived in South Africa in 2000, but I got to feel and to see where people are at. And one of the issues, yes, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happened in South Africa. We want to reconcile people. Did they do everything that had to be done? No, people were still hurting. People are hurting to this day. The hurts of the past, the hurts of racial divides, the hurts that is the poverty manifestation as a result of past hurts, political oppression, is still with the people today. And when we work, whether those who are in position of power or not, they're still working from that place of pain, of suffering, of undealt with issues. We've got wounded leaders, messed up leaders, who are not in a position to lead, by the way, but who are expected to produce miracles that will transform society.
Yeah,
and
George,
that's where, once again, for me.
So I'm jumping in because you're throwing out so many useful things that I want to jump on. But you're mentioning the whole political situation as well, and I think what I'm hearing you saying is that part of the legacy of apartheid has been also that people, even in their political power that the individual does have in a democracy, because we fortunate, at least we have a democracy, at least we're not a dictatorship or a monarchy or some other form, but that there's a lack of maybe because of the weight of things of the past, being able to rightly discern and judge and navigate the political landscape. And I just saw this today, and I didn't watch all of it. I kind of was trying to watch it on my phone when I didn't have Wi-Fi, and it, the Instagram story didn't play nicely. And Kolisi came out in speaking about Black Lives Matter for the first time. He was silent about it, and I only picked up little bits of what he said. And so I hope I'm not saying wrongly what he said, but he was talking about his own experience as a black man, a Xhosa man coming into rugby. And I don't know if he was speaking about the national level or if it was from schoolboy to provincial to all the different levels, but how outside of the community he felt, being in that context, not understanding the culture, the language, the predominant language was often Afrikaans, and coming into it as an outsider and always feeling like an outsider, always feeling out of place in this world in which he is now expected to navigate. And like I said, I missed some of what he said. Maybe you guys saw this or picked this up. But I think what he was saying was one of the things that Rassie Erasmus was able to do well was open a conversation around this, which what I heard him expressing was that in the national team that actually won the World Cup, that they seemed to be able to form a culture, a new culture for the team, because there was an inclusivity of the voices to be able to form something where all the players felt that this was their thing. It wasn't us coming into it from an outside. So I found that fascinating, and I find him to be an incredibly fascinating guy, just the humility with which he carries himself, but he has clout because I just feel like people listen when he speaks because of his track record. But many people didn't get even where he is today. And they're still feeling the way he felt, maybe, as he expressed it, an outsider in a world that they don't fit into. So how does that get addressed? And does it only happen for one guy in a million? And Sia, you're fortunate that things worked out well for you. Is there something about his attitude that was different? Is there something about guys like Rassie that created a different space? There's so many dynamics there, and I don't know if that's a good way of thinking about what you're talking about, George.
I think for me that's part of the issue. It's about understanding. Yes, politically at one point in time, things change. The ANC comes to power. Some talks takes place to reorganize political life. Let's move on. Elections, Mandela president, and we assumed everything will just transform naturally by themselves. There was not enough accompanying process, not enough space created, the Rassie Erasmus space of integration, of engaging honestly some of the deeper issues and the hurts and the challenges that people are feeling on both sides, on all sides, in the diversity of the racial fabric of South Africa. There is a sense in which people were expected, simply because the political solution is there, people will fit in and it will just happen. So along the line, your corruption and so on and the suffering comes in and it begins to trigger the pain. But the Kolisi is not an isolated case. You read as well the story of the cricketer Makayatini, who also said, I used to travel at the back of the bus whenever, or I will decide to run just to avoid being there because I did not fit in. Because these are prominent people. How many others had those same experiences? How many others, even among us as ministers, who would be studying at the seminary, who would be together as regenerated people, who went through the same pains, but we never got the space to engage those emotions, those hurts, those pain. What product will come out of that? It will be a product of a veneered peace, a sense of reconciliation that has a potential to erupt any moment in the future. And the issue of those who were able to come out at the Kolisi, the Sia, those are exceptions. The majority of people, and this is my observation, a lot more people are still struggling and hurting. And we are leading a country from a place of hurt. And the church has not done a good job, because even the church, we have perpetuated those same feelings. And we can look at it ourselves in our own local churches. We can look at it from our denominational background, and we still see, I've got plenty of examples, I'll tell you, of issues where you can see this hurt is still there. The reconciliation is not there. There is a sense in which people simply live and they hope things will just turn out right, but people are not prepared to engage. Let's see. I'll give you one example. One of the stories that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I hope when I get to heaven, I get to forget that. I was invited to go minister to a church. I'm not going to mention the name of the church. And the person who referred me or recommended my name never mentioned which race I was. They simply knew Pastor George. That's a tricky one. Yeah, Pastor George is coming, and I got the confirmation email that says, we're looking forward to having you here. And I got there. At the entrance, all dressed up, suited up. You know how us Congolese how we dress up. So I was already, ready, sharp to do God's business, my Father's business. I get at the gate. The elders and the stewards were there, welcoming people, shaking hands, and they look at me with this puzzling look. Where are you going? By the way, it was a white predominant church. They look at me, and this one guy asked me, one of the elders, but their pastor travel was away in Johannesburg, said, are you looking for direction? Can we help you? You to a place to go?
You should have told them I'm coming
On
to
a
give
Sunday
you direction.
On a Sunday morning, I've got my Bible with me, even if I was not coming to preach, by the way. This is God's church. What kind of question is that? And I'm sitting, they are really completely confused. What is this guy doing here? And I said, no, isn't this church so-and-so? They say, yes, with a puzzling look. And I said, yes, I think I'm at the right place. Okay, can we help you? Say, yeah, I think I'm supposed to be here. So one of them suddenly, because I introduced myself, I'm George, when I greeted them. So one of them at the back comes and says, are you perhaps the preacher we're expecting today?
What are the chances?
I think it's me.
Oh, boy.
And you could sense the awkwardness of the moment. Cut long story short, they rushed me to one of the offices, and I went through an intense interrogation. Very bizarre experience. Sure. And later on, they called me to preach. I get to the pulpit. I preach. I finish preaching, get out. As we were about to leave, people start coming to greet. This older couple comes to me crying.
Sure. And
tells me, sorry, forgive me. And I say, what? For what? Is that something? Can I help you? Can we go somewhere? And just, I want to say it right in front of everyone because I'm feeling guilt. I'm feeling bad. I would have missed on my blessing today just because of the way I looked at you. It tells me when you walked in, when they called you, I said to my wife, what is this? What is this kafir gonna tell me that I don't know?
Sure.
That is in the church. These are people that are living with still some hurts and unresolved issues, but they're in the church, in the pews. By the way, an evangelical church, very close to us. But this is the reality of what people are going through. We hugged, we cried together, we prayed together, but I got that opportunity to engage, not only with the leadership. For them, it was like, let's just get done with this and go. But at least there was someone who was ready to create a short moment of about a few minutes of engaging the pain and the hurts and some sense of healing got there. By the way, I told the Lord after that, please, if I'm invited here again, forgive me, I'm not coming. But but this is the reality that lots of people are going through. Not everyone has those Kolisi's support system, mixture of his own character, of his background, of his own motivation and drive, and also mixture of being married to a white girl, which whether he likes it or not is kind of called to begin to learn how to integrate. Whether that made it easier for him or not, I don't know, but I cannot take away from him his own commitment and dedication and drive. But this support around him of the people and the trust, and let's try him, let's see, let's support him, that produces a great leader. But not everyone sees it the same way. So Mark Fish does not see it the same way. But that's the reality of what we're living in. And a lot of us, millions of South Africans, are going through the same thing. They go to the voting booth with the same hurting feeling in the heart. They will cast a vote for particular organization, not because they're really convinced in their hearts, but because it's coming out of a place of turmoil and pain and struggles. And by the way, even us as Christians, we're falling in the same. Even when we vote, because this reality of wounded souls that want to do things right, but are still struggling because a lot of issues have not been dealt with. A lot of pain are still with us. And we've got stories that we can tell. And I know you guys have your own stories, but these are realities that we live in. And once again, I come back to the church, and I want to acknowledge there are a lot of people out there, a lot of churches that are doing amazing things. I've been part of a number of programs and churches that are doing really great stuff to try and create that kind of space. But I think there is a lot more that needs to be done if we will transform our society and hope it to begin to cast votes that they understand there's a spiritual and a godly calling to transform, to heal, to better society.
George, I mean, thank you for sharing that. Jeremy, you're going to go now. I have stories of where I felt like the outsider, but I don't think they'll ever compare on that level in terms of what you're expressing. And I know other friends, in fact, there's a mutual friend that Jeremy and I have that had a very similar experience in this area. And I think there's many others. So I appreciate you sharing that. Jeremy.
Yeah, no, Martin, I wanted to come back to your comment, or the way you led us into the conversation around power. And in fact, before you mentioned the example of Sia, I was actually wanting to say this. I think we've spoken about political power and economic power, and George, you reminded us about just the historical reality of our unique narrative in the South African context, and then the psychological effects of all of that. But what we've been speaking about now is actually what I wanted to touch on earlier. I think we can call it social power, and the reality is people on the margins, they don't have social power now. I learned this recently, just reading up on the fees must fall, the roads must fall, and subsequently fees must fall movements and the leaders of those movements. Now, these are, when you talk about our recent history, these are young people who they basically, quote unquote, born free, right? They born in 94 or post that. And so they essentially the first generation of Black people who grew up in white spaces. Like, they spent all their lives, and if you think of people who have whose parents were maybe in government or in they had political power, they also had some kind of economic power, and now they find themselves in these tertiary institutional spaces, but they don't have social power. And I think in many ways that probably led to this uprising. I mean, I've spoken to some people recently who've been, as people of color, who've been living and working and studying in white spaces for pretty much all of their lives, like from preschool all the way through. And now they're saying, I had enough, like I can't do this anymore. And I think the reality is that people come to the realization that they don't have social power. Now, when you compound that with the lack of economic power and the lack of political power, it's really only a miracle that we haven't seen some kind of uprising, civil war of sorts in this country. But the issue of social power is something that's complex, and I think even that needs to be interrogated, because even as we've been talking about it now, we've been talking about the fact that there are these people like the Makai Ntinis or the Sia Kolisis who are the outsiders who come into this white space, or George is the outsider and he comes into this white space. And so what is the solution? Well, we need to think about some sort of integrated approach where people can feel like they belong in what? In someone else's space. Mm-hmm. So when it comes back to power, it's still someone else's space. We're just going to do better at making you feel like you fit in here. We're going to, we're going to de-racialize, we're going to learn multicultural skills, but the reality is it's still someone else's space. And I think that's still a lack of social power. So how do we give people their own space? How do we give people the freedom to actually own the space and to be, how do we center people? If we want to use the language of margins, then I guess the opposite of that would be centering. How do we center the marginalized so that it's their space now? And then, like you said, Martin, there have been a few times when you've come into someone else's space. When does that become normative? Because, hey, this is South Africa.
Yeah.
The margins should be the center, you know? And so I think the issue of social space is a huge thing. And it's an invisible factor, particularly for those who, again, who hold the social power, because it's normal. You know, you go to certain parts of a city, and I mean, we had some friends, some colleagues from the ministry that I work with, JLife Africa. We had an international summit here in Cape Town in February of this year, just before lockdown. So we had people here from, I don't know, maybe 20 odd African nations. And so we blocked off some time for just some sightseeing and fun and fellowship. So we did the touristy stuff, and we ended up at the waterfront. My brothers and sisters started asking me like the strangest questions, which are actually, I mean, this is South Africa. So, you know, you become so socialized because our society is so racialized. But for them, it made absolutely no sense. And it should not have made sense. They're going, why are there no black people here in this whole mall? Like, I've been here for 2 hours now. This is Africa, but I haven't seen a single black person. What is going on? You know? And I think for us who've been so normalized by this, we don't realize how much social power are in the hands of the white minority still. And that's a problem. And again, in the church, that's a problem. You know, we want to talk about multicultural churches and all of these fancy things, but who has the power there? You know, who's controlling the story? Who's controlling the culture? Do you bring your culture in, or do you leave your culture at the door, and then we just come into this nebulous multicultural space, which is not actually a multicultural space because somebody still holds the cultural and the social sway.
So let's try and solve the world's problems. I know to try and I think we should try and do another conversation about this, because there's so much more that we need to speak about. But we won't decide that right now. But I want to ask you guys for some solutions, and I'll frame it in this context, because some of the things I have heard from, I think you've mentioned it now, some of the sort of multiculturalism, which really isn't multiculturalism. It's more, like you're saying, it's more just creating space for people in a space that already exists. So there's that side of it. But I've also heard a lot of talk actually from the left side of it, which basically is just new segregation. It just basically says, let's just segregate the races because that's the only way to create space. And I kind of understand where it's coming from, but somewhere in the middle there, as the church, we need to have a better solution, a better way, and maybe we can model something within the church that can be a picture for the world. So what would you say are the practical solutions? Maybe even if you think of the 3 top things that South Africa, and I'm saying South African churches, South African believers should be thinking about and talking about, and then actually can action. How do we actually bridge these things, and how does that become practical without it being tokenism, but really practical?
Can I go first? I'll just go quickly. Stop planting churches in your neighborhoods, because wherever you plant it, unless it's in Parklands on the West Coast in Cape Town, which is a very multicultural community, unless you're planting it there, you're planting it in an apartheid-style segregated community for the most part. Plant churches in the margins. Plant churches where the intersections are. And if there are no intersections, then create the intersections, build the relationships before you plant the church. Because you're fooling yourself, man. You're going to call it a multicultural space, but it's not. It's just a a space where people with different skin tones come together, but their culture is not welcome.
Yeah, that's awesome, Jeremy.
Sorry, and when you do that, those margins, those intersections are not just cultural intersections, they are economic intersections. They are intersections of people with different histories, with different stories, they're on different journeys. If you're serious, then maybe, let's have that kind of conversation, which is also, that can be framed differently. We can frame it simply as, who are your friends? Do all your friends look and think and talk like you? Because if that's the case, then that's also the problem.
I love that. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and it's one of the things that's even drawn us to Bay, because it is very much a church that's in that margin space, and learning how to do that. And also, there's some good friends of ours in the Valley that is busy looking at planting a church exactly in that same way, in sort of down Fish Eagle Park, right on the boundary of Massey, and it's the same idea. So I love that you're saying that, because I've been thinking that has to be part of the way we think about this. But again, would you say in terms of doing that, you also have to be very intentional, but and especially around leadership, I would think George, do you want to?
Yeah, I really agree with Jeremy. That's my heartbeat, really, very strongly. But there definitely has to be an intentionality on how you design that church and how you pull people in, from leadership to membership. There has to be intentionality, because people tend, in our fallen nature, we tend to gravitate towards those who are like us. That there has to be intentionality, and that needs to infuse the teaching. It has to infuse the outcome that we expect the members of the church to produce, and the frames we create, intentionally so, until we begin to live it out as a true, genuine experience of our corporate community life. And really, I agree with that idea. I'm a church planter, and that's really my heart, is creating that space of intersection, that place where people can be together. That's where the idea, the concept, I've been discussing with a good friend, and I'm helping him, advising him on the writing of his thesis. And I kind of forced him to kind of buy into my crazy idea. And it is this idea of the concept of the church as the household of God. Understanding that metaphor of the church as the household of God. That if that is the idea that we run with, this, the church as household of God, when we look in scripture, the household of God is a completely plural in its makeup, in its diversity. It is a place where everyone belongs and everyone flourishes. And creating that space where the church is really at the intersection, a place where everybody belongs and flourishes. When we do that intentionally, we begin to model the process. I think to go with that on denominational levels, there must be a renewal of awareness of intentionality in the leadership, in leadership of churches, in the call of pastors. We can all, I think we can agree on this. If a church was looking for a minister, as a call committee put out, chances are that the Spirit will only speak to the people to call the guy who looks like them. And we will spiritualize it. We will even,
Spirit, George, but that's because the Spirit also looks like the call committee.
Exactly. You see, that's the problem. So there's we'll call the week of we need to go and seek the Lord, and I really have this conviction in my heart that the Lord really is leading us to. But the reality is, our own biases are filling, are boiling out and expressing votes and so on, and we can spiritualize and canonize our decisions, but the reality is our fallenness and taken over. So, and I'm going to use an example, and this is a good example, by the way. So the example
Name and shame.
It's not a shame. It's actually a praiseworthy. So the example of Peter Cornelius is from Claremont Baptist Church is a good example of whatever dynamics happen or however they got to that conclusion. It is an intentional, I believe, because the makeup would not have produced that. And I think it's a godly decision of people who not only, it's not that they do not feel that we would love to have a white, but they were ready to confront their own natural flesh inclination towards doing what is right. What we feel this person is a member of the family of God. Is our brother and our sister, is not a second-class citizen in the family, is not a lesser family member, he is an equal member with full capacity, and if he's got the calling and the ability, this is our pastor, and we feel proud of him. See, it is that level where in our call committee can we transcend our humanity, our fallenness. Can we have this God who's building his family that is multiracial, multilingual, and multicultural, and in which we all flourish? You see, and for me, that is the point. I know you guys more Baptists, so you've got the Baptist Union has had a number of presidents who were people of color, beautiful, but reality, I would call sometimes a cosmetic presentation. But the reality is the church is still overly segregated. Overly segregated. I'll give you one example. I'm not even, I'm black, but sometimes they don't think I'm black enough in the context of South Africa. I'm finishing I finished my bachelor degree, and someone comes and talks to me, are you going to plant a Congolese church? How would that be your first idea in your mind? What would you even think of that? And you are my mentor. You are the person who's shaping my thinking, my theology. And this is what you're producing. For me, that's what the problem is. It begins in how we're producing that. Our training institution, our churches, the intentionality of the product that we want to ultimately present as we're shaping and remodeling the church of God. To come back to your question, yes, plant churches are the intersection, but also let's get back to rethinking our theology, rethinking our theological institution, rethinking the content of what we teach people. We need to get back to that root, because that's where it's all beginning. That's the kind of the type of minister we're producing who will only reproduce after his own kind. There are heavily segregated, racialized ministers who can only reproduce after their own kind. And for me, that's where my heart is. But really, I agree with Jeremy. We've got to start a new movement, not the Black Lives Matter movement, a new movement of churches at the intersection with intentional desire to see that integration, that love of a people of God, under God, that people of God that is living in the family of God, experiencing the koinonia as a people. If we get there, even if it's only one church, we will be able to influence another and another and another and another. And by the way, if Jeremy, you want to plant that kind of church, I can come on board as a co-pastor.
Well, you call him from the States. Fly him in.
We planted the church in July 2018, bro. It's 2 years now.
Amen, amen. That's awesome, brother.
It's still a micro church, but it's going to be a mega church soon.
Never, ever.
Well, it's not up to you. It's up to God, Jeremy.
No, listen, Martin, just one thing from me quickly, and so I think you will resonate with this. I think just this whole conversation about planting in the margins, planting in the intersections, and planting like multicultural, intercultural, not just intercultural families of God, households of God. It allows for intercultural disciple making. And Martin, I think you will attest to this. I mean, you've had a relationship with our mutual friend Percy for a very long time, and for many years he discipled me. Now, and I think you know Percy, George.
Yep. Well, I've worked with them a couple of times at LCCI. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And even now, the person who disciples me and has a lot of input into me is not from my culture. So for many years now, I've been in disciple-making relationships with people from other, and I'm discipling people. I was in a life-on-life situation with someone not from my culture, not from my generation, and he lived in my home. And the way that formed me, I think we are missing out on such a huge opportunity for personal transformation that spills over into, organizational and community transformation. When we miss out on those intercultural discipling opportunities, it's going to change us, and then we'll be able to reproduce after our kind. But the problem is we're reproducing the same old racialized type. So,
yeah. I think I just did a video on which I entitled Church Cancel Culture, which is dealing with the whole concept of naming and shaming false prophets from a distance. When you see someone you don't like, you call them a false prophet. But I was saying, biblically, I don't see a mandate for that because it overreaches the authority of the local church. But more than that, I actually shared the experience I had coming into the pastors' fellowship that Jeremy was part of and that Percy was leading. And I've heard, and as I was thinking through that, I've heard the statement about reading the scriptures in a diverse context. But as I was thinking through that experience and saying in the video, I was saying, look, I think there's a better way, which I think the better way is actually sitting with other people who are different to us. Because that group was a very multicultural group. There was black people, there was colored people, there was white people, and it was very different. But the thing that challenged me the most was not people's culture, it was people's theology. And sitting together and reading scripture week after week after week, reading scripture together, praying together, discipling each other was probably the most formative thing in my entire life, was that thing. And it's still going on. I mean, we're still meeting, some of us. So it's 13 years plus. We meet every single week and we read scripture together and pray together. That's the fundamental thing that we do. And a verse to that, or the contrary to that, is what you're hearing in a lot of, or have heard, and I don't know if it's still the prevailing thought in church planting movements, is plant homogenous churches because they'll grow faster. Plant these homogenous churches in specific areas that reach a specific people group. And I just think that we've completely misunderstood what the gospel of the kingdom is. We've made it this evangelistic thing that if we can just get enough people saved, then Jesus will come back. And that's a very wonky eschatology in itself, because if we think about it, the only thing that goes with us from this creation into the new creation, and there might be some overlap there, we don't know, it's some of those passages, some things that sound like new creation is maybe part of this creation, and it's an interesting concept but the only thing that goes from current creation into new creation is people. So the only thing you can invest in and then get the benefit of is other people, is actually pouring into other people. So I'm loving what you guys are saying, because I think it is a completely rethinking of our theology of the kingdom and of the church, and how we then practice that. So I find that very, very exciting. And I do think that it's happening in some places already. I've already seen some of it beginning. God's moving, and it's interesting because you just hear of this and you hear of that over there, and it's like you become aware of things that God is doing. Any last thoughts from you guys before we wrap it up?
None from me. Thanks for doing this, Martin. Thanks for being willing to have a conversation, and for being willing to have difficult conversations, and also fielding the comments that could come from antagonists and people who just are not willing to have difficult conversations. It's easier to just throw comments and shut conversations down. So thanks for facilitating this.
Yeah, and just to say on that, Jeremy, I think, like I said, I'm taking the devil's advocate role, but I think if we don't come from those angles, we're not going to find each other. We need to find ways to come from these very polar opposite points and actually find each other. So I've really appreciated you guys in just being so gracious with your time, but also with just giving of yourselves in this way, because I find this very enriching. I could do this for a few more hours, but I think it's good to it's good to have a time limit. We can Jeremy's run away. Okay, George. Jeremy's run. George, your final thoughts. He's back.
Once again, really thank you very much for this opportunity just to be part of the conversation. I'd like just to end with this idea that we started with, the question of the Black Lives Matter, and not as a movement, and not as an organization, but as an idea for those who are in the margin. I think we need to integrate that as part of our own thinking. It's part of the call of God for the marginalized, the quartet of the Old Testament, the orphan, the refugees, and so on, the widows. This idea of those who are on the margin that deserves a special attention. It's not the idea that they are better than. It's simply a call of God to be to the contour of justice that calls us to a sense of partiality toward the disadvantaged. There is a point in which God himself will do that, where he will tend to be overly concerned with a particular people, with the widow, with the orphans, not because the others are not important, but that's part of the justice of God that sway towards the partiality towards the disadvantaged, in the sense of bringing back justice. And I think South Africa, the Black people who are living in poverty with no power and so on, and struggles that are going through a poverty and so on, there is a strong desire, strong mandate from God for the church, for us as believers, to lean towards that partiality towards the disadvantaged. And this case is the poor, the Black, the women in the context of South Africa. I think we should not be ashamed of doing that. That will be doing the biblical thing. When the church stands with the lesser fortunate, the weaker ones, the struggling ones, unapologetically fighting for them, supporting them, and re-establishing that sense of justice. I think that is a godly calling, a godly mandate that the church should actually be the advocate of it. Need to be in the forefront of moving. If we don't do that, other organizations will take the space, and we will cry foul. We will say other agendas because we have abdicated our own space, our responsibility.
Yeah, thank you, George. I mean, as you were speaking, I was just thinking again of Judgment Day that Jesus says in Matthew 24, we're going to be judged on our works, which is obviously our understanding of theology is those works are the genuine works of faith. So it's not that it's shifted the theology, but those works, he says, it's how you treated those in prison, those who are hungry, those who are naked. And that's how Jesus is going to judge us one day. So just reminded of that, George, as you speak. Guys, I thank you. I thank you for generosity of your time and your ideas. And I hope we can do this again. I think this is very valuable. If it's only valuable for me, then I'll do it because I'm selfish. But I do believe it's valuable for the church. I do believe that it's valuable for many people to be having these conversations, and I think healthy conversations. And what I love about our conversation is relationship, because there's a relationship that's already existent, which I think it gives us a lot of room with each other, because we know each other's hearts. We've journeyed enough to know where we're coming from. So I really appreciate that, both of you. And I wish you all well. George, I wish you well in your studies. Jeremy, I wish you well in your watching spy series and and everything else you do.